So I want to welcome everybody that has joined us so far. My name is Danny Jensen. I am the programs chair for the Los Angeles City Historical Society. And we're excited for our presentation tonight. We're joined by author James Tejani, and he's going to share some insights from his debut book. And we'll get into that in a moment, but I will hand things over for a moment to our president, Charlie Mims, and he will tell you a little bit more about what we do.
Well, first, I'd like to welcome everybody. I'm especially looking forward to hearing from James about the port tonight. One of our members of the board has written several books on the Port of Los Angeles, and so I'm looking forward to hearing more that James can bring to shed more light on the history of the port. And the Los Angeles City Historical Society has been around since the early 70s, founded by some historians in the local area. And we're fortunate enough to have had an archivist in the Los Angeles City Archives on the board for a number of decades. We've officially been named the Friends of the City Archives of the City Council of the City of Los Angeles. We have published a 2-volume history of the government of the City of Los Angeles, which I hope some of you will become familiar with. And we produce currently through Danny Jensen these Zoomcasts to help elucidate people about different aspects of the history of the City of Los Angeles. And when I say the City of Los Angeles, I'm talking about the general Southern California area, because if you go back to the 1850s, Los Angeles and San Diego were considered Southern California. And Orange County didn't even become a separate county from Los Angeles County until later in the 1800s. So we look at this as sort of a regional opportunity to share the history of the area. And we produce also something called the Marine Northup Lecture Series during the spring, 3 series of very informative presentations at the Central Library in the City of Los Angeles. And so if you check our website, you'll get more information about that. Those of you that have not yet joined, I would encourage you to join the LA City Historical Society. Besides the things I mentioned, we also provide scholarships to a number of young historians in the local colleges and universities in the Los Angeles area. And we're hoping to continue to do that and expand that. And in order to do these types of things, we rely on the support, both active individually and financial support of folks that take advantage of these presentations. So I don't want to say too much more. There's a lot more we could say, but I'd like to turn it back to Danny so that we can get started with the presentation, which I'm really looking forward to.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Charlie. You'll see I dropped a link there in the chat if for those of you who haven't joined as members yet or are looking to support us in additional ways. That is always welcome as we approach the end of the year. And I will also share a few upcoming items that we have. I'm going to share the link there so you can have it handy. Obviously, you are here for the webinar at the top of the list there. And following that, we have the tour of Clifton's downtown, which is reopening once again. They had some renovations they had to make. So we're very excited about that. It is currently sold out, but we are talking with them and seeing if we can accommodate more people either for that tour, and then it's looking like possibility of doing another tour. So highly recommend you join as a member. You can get discounted tickets for that, and early access to a lot of our other events, as well as some of our members only events. So Charlie mentioned that we are official friends of the LA City Archive. So you'll see further down, if you look at that list of events, we have the upcoming tour of the LA City Archives. So Mike Holland, our city archivist, leads a tour there. We're typically doing them about quarterly now, and they always sell out. So you all are actually in on here, getting in here a little bit early. Charlie, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something. It's a tour of Clifton's cafeteria in downtown area. And for those of you that are not aware, that Mr. Clifton back in the 30s was a active reformer of government in the city of Los Angeles, and helped to get out a corrupt mayor and get installed a judge that helped reform the city government. So it should be a very interesting tour. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, definitely a lot of fascinating history there with Clifton's, and some of you may, remember going there when you were younger or when your parents went, and they've taken great care to restore it. And the current owner, Andrew, who has done all the renovations since 2015, he will be leading the tour. So that should be a lot of fun. And then, as I mentioned, the archives tour. Definitely recommend you joining us for that. It's a fascinating tour. You get a chance to see really fascinating documents of LA history, maps, and it's just a one-of-a-kind experience. So that is members only. So if you aren't a member, I encourage you to join, and then you can join us for that tour. It will sell out. So definitely encourage you to jump on that. And just keep an eye out there and join our newsletter, which you may already be on. That's why you're here. But we'll have plenty more events coming up, both webinars and in-person events. So with that, I would like to turn it over to our guest for the evening. So give just a little bit of intro here. The author James Tejani is a historian and is also a professor in the California State University system. He will tell you a little bit more about his history and how he came about to writing this book. But we're really excited for James to share with us A Machine to Move Ocean and Earth, the Making of the Port of Los Angeles and America. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, James. And I'll note if anyone has questions, feel free to use the Q&A portion there. You'll see down below of your screen there. And we'll have a little Q&A session at the end there. And if you're having trouble with the Q&A, you can always use the chat, but Q&A is also an option there. So with that, thank you, James.
Okay, thank you, Danny, and thank you, Charlie. And welcome to all of you, the web audience, and thank you for attending. I also should thank the organization, the LA City Historical Society, and again to Danny Jensen for hosting, for publicizing this event. Geraldine Natz also deserves a thank you as well, not only for her writings and contributions to the Port of LA's history, but also for introducing me to Danny so we could schedule this event. And lastly, I'd like to thank my publisher, W.W. Norton, for producing the book that we are here to discuss. And I look forward to discussing it with all of you. So it is a great fact of our time that Los Angeles is a leading US and world city. Not merely for its size, not just for being a center for culture and media, but for its place in the global economy and its role connecting the United States and California to world markets via the port of San Pedro Bay, the ports of San Pedro Bay, excuse me. So the Bay is an immensely powerful, indispensable site, impacting the lives of billions of people across the US and abroad each day. Now that presents a special opportunity for all of us as writers, students, tellers of LA history. There are innumerable stories to discover, to work through, to join together that joined together the local, the national, and the global. And in doing so, we can create histories that speak to how people live in our own time. But there is a countervailing fact as well. For all of its importance, neither LA nor its harbors at San Pedro Bay have been given prominence within larger narratives of US history scholarship. It's certainly not equivalent to their stature today. Working to fill that absence, I think, is one of the things that brings us together in groups like the LA City Historical Society. And ultimately, it became my purpose in writing this book. That's not how things started, however. I actually didn't set out to be an advocate for Los Angeles and its past. And I didn't set out to be part of conversations like this one. It was the book's unexpected development that brought me here. And so in this talk, I'll explain how, as well as how that development ultimately shaped the book's argument. So I came to this project as someone who had left Los Angeles in Southern California, perhaps for good. I grew up in Long Beach. I went to college in San Diego. But then when it came time to study history, and when it came to learning more about history at the graduate level, I found I was interested in national questions first and foremost. And that meant really from the perspective of the Northeast, where I ended up in school. Then, as I learned more about history scholarship, I became especially interested in the question of how 19th century US expansion across the continent and into the Pacific, how that came about, and whether those two episodes, Western and Pacific, might better be woven together. So I landed in the East, looking west, and looking to kind of bring stories together. Now, that seemed timely when I was in school for two reasons. My graduate mentors, as well as historians generally, had begun to talk about the Pacific Rim and the Pacific world and how its influence on contemporary, they began to talk about the Pacific Rim and the Pacific world and its influence on contemporary US society, particularly through trade and by China's ascendance in geopolitics. But that sensibility was not quite part of how they wrote the nation's past yet, which remains centered in the East. And if anything, while I was in school, historians tended to talk up the Atlantic and Caribbean histories all the more. So I thought, likewise, when I thought about and looked at histories of the American West, Western historians had made great strides in claiming a place within the broader US field. And that includes Southern California and US historians as well. And that had trickled into how history was practiced even in the Northeast. But it seemed to be mostly by addition. And what I mean by that is, sure, the West had found its way into existing narratives, but it remained to be seen how or how far Western history might transform those narratives into something new. So while I was still a graduate student, I found myself thinking about the following questions. Did the Trans-Pacific networks of the 21st century of our time have any direct origin in the events of 19th century US expansion, particularly events coming from the East or in the East, in ways that might integrate those stories? Second, I thought, was there a Western place capable of bringing together these stories, but also capable of transforming them? Those two questions are what led me, sitting in New York, to begin thinking about California and its major harbors, but not quite Los Angeles yet. As I perhaps should be a little embarrassed to admit to this crowd, it was San Francisco's waterfront development that was my initial choice for a research project. US expansionists coveted that natural harbor by already the 1830s, late 1830s, and it remained a place of national significance all the way from the gold rush forward. But something happened. Several months into my research, I heard that a PhD student had just finished a dissertation on San Francisco's waterfront. So when I actually started work on San Pedro Bay's story, I was really only hoping to salvage a dissertation project because there was a problem. The Bay's harbor development lay in the 20th century, well after San Francisco's and after the episodes of US expansion that I was interested in connecting. And of course, there was an additional problem, which was that Phineas Banning's story was known and well told. So it seemed like I had hit a dead end. And I know many of us are familiar with that feeling. Despite my meticulously crafted questions and my grad student enthusiasm, I learned the hard way that the past often doesn't give us historians what we hope for. But I also found out in writing this book, if we're lucky, the seeming dead end leads us to something else, maybe something better. And I do consider myself lucky because in this case, the dead end led me to the characters whose stories would make this book possible. Although it was not by my intention, the book I ended up writing is built around characters, a cast of characters. And one in particular provides the thread that tied the book together. And this is Edward Ord. Ord became crucial to telling the story for a couple reasons. Because it was his life that linked up to nearly all the other major characters in the book. It also linked up to many of the big events in the harbor's subsequent development. And furthermore, his path through history ended up helping me connect San Pedro Bay to distant and seemingly unrelated events. So across a much larger geography that included the West, the East, and the Pacific. Before this book, Edward Ord's name did appear in histories of Los Angeles, and many of you probably know that. He's known for making the first US-era survey of the Pueblo in 1849, and he even laid out some of the downtown streets that we still use today. Ord Street, in fact, is named in 1890, but it's still located in Chinatown, in the Chinatown district today. Ord also published a travel log of his 1856 visit to the Pueblo, which remains a really valuable firsthand account for us historians, and some of you perhaps have looked at it. But all of this paled in comparison to the reputation that Edward Ord earned in the Civil War, when he rose to the rank of Major General, and quite a successful one at that. By 1865, Ord was on the staff of Ulysses Grant. He was put in command of the Army of the James during the final defeat of Robert E. Lee's Confederate troops near Richmond, Virginia. And he's commemorated for that. So here are two well-known paintings of the war's end. The first is from 1865, Grant and his generals, which is much bigger than this, and it hangs in the National Portrait Gallery, something definitely worth a visit. Which has them, I presume, riding to victory at the end of the war. It was clear things were winding down. And Edward Ord is right here. Not in the front, but quite close to his commanders. We also have from the Centennial in 1965, this painting that was commissioned by National Geographic. That's actually of the surrender agreements being signed in the McLean House at Appomattox Courthouse, the town. And so Edward Ord appears right there. Those of you who know Reconstruction history also will encounter Ord's name because he served as the commander, really the first commander of occupied Richmond after the Civil War had ended. And he serves as the military governor of Mississippi and Arkansas during congressional Reconstruction. in that period, 1867, 1868. So clearly, he was and is a celebrated figure. But as I was reading through archival documents about San Pedro Bay's early history, especially maps and property documents, I kept encountering Edward Ord's name. It was on the earliest US government charts of Southern California's coast, as you can see right here, as well as on the first survey of Wilmington from the mid-1850s, when it was subdivided and sold from the Dominguez family's Rancho San Pedro. Both of those things seemed important, and obviously they're important, but they seemed without enough explanation. So that piqued my interest. Then my interest grew as I learned more about Edward Ord's background. So he was a career Army officer, a lifer. Between the years 1839 and 1880, 41 years, the Army was his employer. He never left it. And coastal land surveys were typically not Army duty. Yet for 18 months between 1853 and 1855, that's exactly what Ord was doing. So what was going on? What had brought Ord to San Pedro Bay, and what was he up to? As I found out, Ord was filling in for somebody else. And as part of one of the most important scientific projects of the time. And that someone else was George Davidson. And Davidson, perhaps those of you who haven't read the book, is going to be less familiar because he's a forgotten figure of 19th century US history. At the time, he was a pioneering scientist in the fields of astronomy, oceanography, water resources, and mapping. He helped document our state's indigenous and Spanish history, and he used that knowledge to standardize many of the West Coast place names that we still use today. So we owe our map of the region to Davidson, as I'll explain, in more ways than one. Davidson lived for most of his adult life at San Francisco. He's not an Angelino. But his career began in Washington, D.C. So he has an Eastern connection. Around 1845, at the age of 20, Davidson was recruited by the leading scientific agency of his era, the United States Coast Survey. And that was the predecessor to today's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, as well as the National Weather Service. The survey superintendent was Alexander Dallas Bache, who happened to be Benjamin Franklin's great-grandson and an eminent scholar at the time. He was also an influential figure among the nation's politicians and military commanders. Davidson became Bache's protege and ranks among his most accomplished students and peers. And that's quite a list of names. But Davidson would need that talent and more because the Coast Survey was a mapping agency first and foremost. And we're not talking about straightforward conventional maps. The agency was responsible for making highly precise long distance maps, the kind that could pinpoint coastal locations, landmarks, and hazards like a submerged reef. And that was difficult to do because unlike the map's sheet of paper, the Earth is not flat. Instead, it's a vast curved surface. And I know that's an obvious point, but it has further significance because the undulation and varying effects of gravity actually make the Earth an imperfect sphere. And the longer distance one tries to incorporate into a map, the more the curvature, size, irregularity, and variation contributes to inaccuracy. So this was the surveys and Davidson's essential problem. In effect, they had to find ways to map the Earth in 3 dimensions, but without the benefits of the modern technology we have today, things like computers, satellites, and GPS. And in 1850, Bache decided that Davidson would be the one to lead this work in California, which the US had recently acquired from its war with Mexico. The mission was vital to national interests because the region's coastline was still unknown and it was highly dangerous for shipping. So remember, at the time, ships are carrying tens of thousands of gold seekers and huge amounts of gold outbound, destined for the banks and national treasury in the East and even in Europe. Moreover, the map was vital to national interest because it would help the US claim the Pacific coast as part of its territory. A map made that argument, and scientific precision strengthened the claim. So this was a very important job that this young man was sent to do. And Davidson would accomplish the task through mathematics, especially the use of trigonometry. A method called geodesy or geodetic triangulation, which, if you're not familiar with, is basically the use of Euclidean geometry and the relationship of angles and sides in a triangle to precisely solve for unknowns. It was difficult work. It was rigorous work with the eyes and the use of instruments, many of which were relatively new at the time. It could also be lonely, physically suffering and punishing, and even life-threatening work. So this was the very important scientific project I referred to a few minutes back. And the first section of my book focuses on how that project took shape in Washington, D.C., in the East, as well as on Davidson's experiences with it in California and the Pacific coast. Now, Davidson was one of the first characters I encountered in my research back while I was still thinking about a San Francisco and broadly Pacific Coast project. So I didn't quite see how he fit into San Pedro Bay's history specifically. That's probably why he's relatively unknown among us LA historians. But the mystery would solve itself once I followed Edward Ord's path backwards. Because of San Pedro Bay's orientation, its inland topography, and very importantly, the offshore island of Santa Catalina, Davidson and the Coast Survey decided in 1852 that San Pedro was the best spot to anchor a region-wide mapping project. So this would be the southern anchor nearest the Mexican border. And its benefit was that it would produce the most accurate measurements and hence the most precise map. That ended up meaning something very important to the story, because it meant that George Davidson didn't value San Pedro Bay for a harbor. He valued it for the sake of science and kind of a bigger picture. Same with Beach. They didn't see San Pedro as valuable in and of itself. Certainly not as a harbor, and certainly not compared to places like San Francisco, Monterey, San Diego, the Columbia River mouth, and later Puget Sound as well, which was just being settled. Davidson would hold on to those doubts about San Pedro throughout his life. And that became important because Davidson doesn't stay at San Pedro. The Coast Survey and the federal government needed his valuable skills elsewhere, places that seemed more important at the time. And so Davidson set up the project. He set up what you see on the screen as the red line, the baseline for the triangulation series. So this was the starting point. It had to be perfectly accurate. Otherwise, the subsequent triangles would not be. So he worked on setting that up, and then he left. He left to examine the border region between Washington Territory and British Columbia, the North Coast, what would be the north anchor for the geodetic map of the West Coast. And in summer 1853, the Coast Survey handed off the work near San Pedro to Edward Ord, an Army officer that the agency had on temporary loan from the Army. And Ord did see San Pedro as an important future harbor, critical to the story. And as we'll see, he was not alone. So stay tuned. But by tracing Ord's steps thus far, I found the book's first narrative thread, a triangle appropriately enough. And I found that San Pedro had a significant place in the story of US territorial expansion, even seen from the east in the 1850s, and most especially in the effort to secure the Pacific coast during and after the gold rush. By itself, this added a new dimension to LA's and the nation's past. But the story still had some loose threads. For example, Edward Ord was at San Pedro Bay for the Coast Survey's geodetic project, which meant that his official tasks lay in the waters offshore, out to Catalina, up through the Channel Islands to Point Conception. Ostensibly, his work and the project overall had little to do with the mainland, and his project had nothing to do with promoting or making new harbor sites. So how did Ord's name end up on the initial map of San Pedro's inner bay, its tidal lagoon or estuary? And why was his name on the subdivision from the Dominguez Rancho that would later become Wilmington? That latter question becomes more puzzling when we consider that Mexican land grants, because of the US-Mexico Treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, as well as the 1851 congressional law, those lands were classified as part of the federal public domain. They were neither the Coast Survey's nor Ord's to survey, at least not officially. So the mystery of figuring out Ord's actions ended up drawing me in yet another direction, further into California's history, its Hispanic settlement, but also back to Washington, D.C., and the slaveholding South as well. And this is when my mind started to get blown. Because to recap, it was the Army and the US War Department that had loaned Ord to the Coast Survey in 1853. At the time, the department's head, the War Secretary, was a very well-known figure, Jefferson Davis. Now, Davis, of course, later would be president of the separatist Confederate States, the 4 years of his life for which he is most remembered for, infamous for. But prior to the Civil War, Davis was a prominent member of the Democratic Party, even considered a contender for the US presidency. Because around Washington, D.C., Davis was considered, and he had a reputation as a national leader. Now that conflicts with his later actions with regards to the Confederacy. But at the time, his Southern and pro-slavery views were considered consistent with his national service. In the 1850s, national and sectional ideas complemented one another in politics. They were not quite thought incompatible or contradictory, certainly not widely thought so. As a case in point, Davis was a prominent a prominent supporter of science, Yankee science even, in both the national interest and the sectional interest. He was a champion of the Army Engineers, a regent of the Smithsonian Institution, and he was a great ally of Alexander Dallas Bache and the Coast Survey. Davis and Bache were close friends, they traveled together, and they perhaps knew each other since their days as West Point cadets. Of course, in supporting science, Davis was sharp enough to understand that coast and ocean charts were vital to the Cotton South and its transatlantic commerce, as well as the nation's commerce. But he was able to mix both of those agendas very seamlessly. One other case of Davis mixing objectives like that is going to be relevant here and came into the story. While he was War Secretary, Davis was intent on building a transcontinental railroad to reach the Pacific coast. And this intersected with his views of science. It was a supremely national objective. Yet Davis was determined that the railroad should originate from the southern states. And those would be the routes that you see on the screen that run through New Mexico territory. There would be 2 of them. Davis believed that this was the best route, both on engineering principles and cost basis. He also believed it was necessary to correct an imbalance within the federal government, one created by California's statehood. And he believed that that threatened the country's future. This imbalance was the growing predominance of free states and anti-slavery interests over the slaveholding states. So again, we get this very interesting mix where Davis clearly wanted to perpetuate and spread slavery, but he wanted to do that as a way to preserve the United States as he knew it. And so in the spring and summer of 1853, he and the War Department sent out explorers, scientists from the Army's Topographical Engineering Corps to chart the railroad routes of the West. A southern route was favored, but it was not assured. To better the odds, Davis needed something else, something that brings us back to California, an ocean terminus. And he needed that ocean terminus in Southern California, where a southern rail line would find the sea. And this was at the very same time that Edward Ord arrived at San Pedro to do coast survey work. Indeed, in 1855, Ord would send a map, or perhaps maps, to Washington, D.C., suggesting San Pedro's estuary, or its inner harbor as he called it, to be appropriate, precisely what Davis needed. Ord's recommendation also appears in print in Davis's 1856 report on the Transcontinental Railroad, submitted to Congress and the President, Franklin Pierce. So this set up a second narrative triangle among Edward Ord, his Coast Survey boss, Alexander Dallas Bache, and Ord's Army boss, the War Secretary Jefferson Davis, who also happened to be tied closely to Alexander Dallas Bache. But there was more still. A railroad terminus at San Pedro Bay required that the land be owned and developed by locals favorable to Davis's project. And Edward Ord seemed to work this angle too, for he had become a trusted friend and advisor to Manuel Dominguez, whose Rancho San Pedro contained much of the estuary. And in 1854 and 1855, Ord would broker Dominguez's sale of a parcel on the estuary to the Wilmington Syndicate, which soon included Phineas Banning. The group hoped to develop a waterfront town and harbor, in fact, to displace Los Angeles altogether as the region's commercial hub. Ord surveyed on both sides of the land deal for both buyers and sellers, for Dominguez and for the Newtown Syndicate, Wilmington Syndicate. And he did something else. Beyond the parcel, Ord claimed additional acreage, the navigable portion of the estuary, which he deemed a federal reservation and no longer part of the Dominguez Ranch. And that added step perhaps ended the friendship between Ord and Dominguez. We don't know for certain. Hence, Edward Ord brought to light 3 triangles in the story that would make up my book. 2 within the federal government, and there they are, and 1 locally in Los Angeles. And by way of these shapes, and from my starting point of an apparent dead end, I found myself in a story about interconnected episodes of 19th century US expansion. Western conquest and science, the crisis over slavery section in Civil War, and the making and unmaking of a local borderland society. All of this reaching from east to west to the Pacific and back again. Ord and his shapes linked these stories together, as did A Harbor in the Making. So that raised the central questions of my book. Was Edward Ord, prior to becoming a great hero of the war, the Civil War, part of Davis's plans to secure a Southern railroad and push slavery westward into new states? Was that the true purpose for which he came to San Pedro as part of the Coast Survey? Now, I emphasize Ord's heroics because in thinking about these questions and the possibilities, we shouldn't forget that we're talking about Edward Ord in the mid-1850s. He doesn't know what's going to happen in just a few years in 1861. And he ultimately denies and defies all of these connections by remaining loyal to the Union in 1861. Ord very much rose to the occasion and the great crisis of his times. So I say that just to point out that Ord, the person, is less the point. Instead, I think Ord and his triangles demonstrate something bigger, that San Pedro Bay and Los Angeles were not merely places experiencing historical events locally or merely those made elsewhere in the East. To the contrary, the local history in Los Angeles early on became a driver, a powerful driver, and integrated into those distant events. Meanwhile, Southern California's coast became the place where the United States established dynamics for its long-term relationship with the Pacific, a relationship of promise, of reward, as much as of troubles and challenges, and one that continues to this day. And that directs us to the here and now, and the period that is the subject really of the final one-third of my book. Ord's survey has an afterlife, but in this case, the lasting effects aren't obvious at first, and they weren't obvious to me researching and writing the book. After all, what difference did Ord's actions at San Pedro make? George Davidson's geodetic map of the West Coast is completed, but long after Ord left to return to the Army. Jefferson Davis doesn't get his Southwest Railroad, at least not until after the Civil War had destroyed his reputation and slavery as well. Nonetheless, Ord's work remains with us in two ways worth noting. On one hand, Ord's work enabled private property to take over the bay's waterfront, especially the area around the estuary, and stay that way through the rest of the 19th century. The frontage that he surveyed at Wilmington ended up becoming the site of Phineas Banning's Wharf in 1858, which you can see down just at the bottom of the map above the P in Pedro. And that would become the basis of Banning's growing real estate empire in Wilmington and inside the estuary. During the Civil War, Banning's investments are what will attract the Union Army, led by James Carleton, to use Wilmington as a harbor, as it prepared to retake, New Mexico territory from secessionists. And those troops would mostly fight and dispossess bands of Apache and Navajo, using a combination of supply and environmental deprivation that San Pedro Bay made possible. We can take a step further. Together, Banning's private property and the process of Indian removal in the Southwest are what ends up attracting the Southern Pacific Railroad in the 1870s and 1880s to San Pedro Bay. And in the process of all of that, it would extend the reach of California and Los Angeles interests deep into the desert, creating a commercial hinterland for a growing city. And today, the Port of Los Angeles continues to serve this Sunbelt interior. But if in the short term, Ord's work enabled a robust and monopolistic private sector to take shape around San Pedro Bay and its harbors, that result did not last. The reason is because Ord had several employers. The buyers and sellers of the Wilmington parcel on one side, but the US government too. So at the same time Ord's survey made private property, recall that it also claimed the estuary's navigable channel and waters as federal property, a US reservation from the public lands. And so that's what you're seeing here in this map. The red line separating the Dominguez Rancho San Pedro on the right side of the image from the left side, the estuary, and what Ord had deemed the navigable reservation. And the dotted line is the boundary within the estuary between the Rancho San Pedro and the Rancho Palos Verdes on the other side. Now, the government did little to assert this claim for 4.5 decades, but things would change in the 1890s with the Spanish-American War. The US annexation of Hawaii and the Philippines also, and the start of construction on the Panama Canal, all of which greatly enhanced US interests, maritime and imperial, in the Pacific. And all of the same likewise enhanced Los Angeles's interests as well. In that context, the US government and Supreme Court would rediscover Ord's survey and use it to argue that the nation and its people, the public, had a long-standing and overriding claim to the bay's waters. The result would be the master plan around which the modern Port of Los Angeles is developed. 2 parts: the construction of an outer breakwater, which lies offshore, and what's depicted on, in a primitive way on this map, the drawing of US harbor lines inside the estuary to design the inner harbor. And these were areas that the engineers would end up, the Army engineers would end up dredging into deep water. And the map is much like the time, it's a mess of lines. The proposed US harbor lines are the darkest or thickest lines, but that's superimposed with private land claims, the tidelands claims that are still in dispute, and I think some areas that are still being redrafted at the time by the engineers. So what you want to look for are these areas where the Army engineers are either following Ord's lines of 1855 or taking them as a guide for a further step. And that further step would be using the federal harbor lines to give clearer definition to the adjacent space of tidelands, which Los Angeles would gain ownership of as a result of court cases that began in 1908. And if you can see my cursor, I'm not sure if you can, this is a perfect example of the harbor lines really starting to spell out where that tideland area might be, and putting it up for grabs.
And yes, we can see the cursor, James.
Perfect. So Los Angeles obviously would win title to those tidelands as a result of those court cases. And so what we have is that Edward Ord's story is not merely his, nor just about the US as it was long ago. It ends up being one of modern Los Angeles, and hence one for its historians and storytellers today. Thank you very much for listening. Danny, back to you.
Excellent. Thank you, James. That was fantastic. So I'm going to open it up for questions. I see one submitted there already, but everyone feel free to join in here. And I'll mention too, I'll drop a link in the chat too, for those of you who like to pick up a copy of James's book.
And Danny, if I could just add one thing, historically speaking.
Yeah.
When Ford was a young Army officer stationed in California, he took a commission from the city of Los Angeles to map the downtown area of the city of Los Angeles. And so one of our very earliest maps of the downtown area was a result of Captain Ord's survey.
I'll open up to questions here. If Colleen, where did you find these? Speaking of the maps, where did you find these great historical maps? Did you have any problems obtaining copies of them?
So many of the maps I used, especially at the end, a number of them come from the Huntington Library, which has begun to digitize them and put them up. And so they're very user-friendly to look through. And the Huntington is always great with permissions. And they were very helpful in obtaining the rights to reprint. Other maps are government maps. So I believe the map of the harbor lines, I believe that was from a newspaper, so it was reprinted in newspapers. But I obtained similar maps like that actually from the California State Lands Commission, which has them because they originally had title to tidelands before they relinquished them to Los Angeles in 1909. Great question.
Yeah. And those wanting to see more maps too, again, the archives tour is that's a great option. From John, how did the federal lands become owned by the city of LA?
I think in large part, I believe they don't. So I believe what you're really looking for is, well, so actually that is a complex question. So there's going to be several routes. So Edward Ord in 1855 claims a U.S. reservation for navigable waters. And I think this is actually part of where this becomes a little controversial looking back historically. So he's claiming really the big chunk of the estuary for the federal government, not really thinking about the state's title to the tidal margin around it. And he doesn't define the borders very clearly in the survey that he does. So he uses survey methods that later, about 30 years later, are going to be called into question when the Dominguez family challenges all of this. And so he is really thinking about the federal government. He's not thinking about the state. But the US Congress had already passed a law called the Arkansas Act, which started to define federal public domain that would be relinquished to states in areas of swamp or overflowed lands. And their idea was that the state land offices could better dispense of this to settlers than the federal general land office. And so I don't know that that was really on Ord's radar, although by default, simply by declaring the federal reservation, it raised the legal question. And so that legal question is going to end up being filled in by county surveyors who in the 1860s begin filing state tideland patents on the behalf of people like Phineas Banning, and then eventually some of the railroad interests as well. And so the distinction between the state domain and the federal domain takes form in a kind of murky, slow, indeterminate way that will really be the cause for a lot of the litigation that comes later. So the tidelands would have been California's. However, the California legislature, led by LA representatives, is able to push for the state to relinquish in 1909 once LA expands, does the shoestring annexation, and then consolidates with San Pedro and Wilmington. So they really deserve the legislative credit for that. And then I think there's only a couple federal patents in the estuary that are US swamp and overflowed lands. Those are there, but they're the minor portion of the patents. So those were federal, and I believe they still fall within the area that the Army Engineers ends up developing.
And if I could add to that, James and Danny, the federal government has control over navigable waterways within the United States, but oftentimes they've, uh, I guess for lack of better professional terminology, they sort of sublet that to states. And so the state of California really controls tidelands within the state of California. And it's the state that is essentially subletted to the city of Los Angeles. And of course, this has not only been a legal and survey and technical process, but a political process. And because the city of Los Angeles wanted to create a port to make itself a sort of an international city, and basically to increase business for the region of the city of Los Angeles. So if you actually, not that anybody has sailed even a brigantine up the Los Angeles River, but if you go up to the Van Nuys area of the Los Angeles River and the Sepulveda Basin, that's actually controlled by the Army Corps of Engineers because it's considered a navigable waterway. And so in a like measure, the San Pedro Bay area, including the ports of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach, fall under that. And so ultimately, it's under the control of the Army Corps of Engineers, but in a practical matter, it's under control of the State Tidelands Commission, who delegated the city of Los Angeles to control those areas within the Port of Los Angeles. And they can only use those areas for the purposes in policy of the State Tidelands Commission. And as a result, just to get a little political about it, when Dick Reardon was mayor back in the 1990s in Los Angeles, he wanted to use money from the Port of Los Angeles to help float the city budget in general. And they went to court. The city went to court and lost on that because the State Tidelands Commission prevailed that those monies can only be used for the purposes of, commerce and other purposes set forth by the Tidelands Commission. So it gets, as James indicated, it gets very complicated and murky in a hurry.
Yeah, and I should also add, I think, Charlie, to clarify something you said, it ended up being quite a brilliant way to distribute costs for the development of the harbor. And someone deserves credit for that.
And control.
Yes.
Thank you both. Next question, did you ever come across Le Corvair? I believe he was a map maker in Wilmington, also in Fry's Avenue School here in Wilmington, named after Amos Fry's.
Yes, I came across both of them. Le Couvreur, and forgive me if I'm not quite pronouncing it. He published a memoir that I looked at about his early days, and his name's on a ton of maps. He didn't make it into the book, but I did come across him, and he's very important to the history of the harbor area around Wilmington. I almost used a map actually for the slideshow, thinking that Ord's name would be on it, and it was Frank Le Couvreur. And the name is Fry's. Yeah, he's in the book, and he's so important to that stage of the drafting of the U.S. harbor lines in 1906, 1907 into 1908.
Thank you.
And Danny, just a little plug for our archives tour.
Mm-hmm.
The city archives actually have a petition sent by leading businessmen and others in the city of Los Angeles to Congress to allow the city to have control over those lands to create a port of Los Angeles. And this is back from the 1800s. So there was active political lobbying going on then to create a port for Los Angeles to help develop the region.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, James, we'll have to get you on one of our tours.
I would love it.
I have a question from Colleen. When had enough of the dredging been completed so that ships could dock in San Pedro? Before that time, they had to anchor quite a ways offshore, use smaller boats to bring passenger and good to and from ships.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in part it gets beyond the book and later down the timeline. And someone like Geraldine Natz would really know a precise answer for that. So um, they are using small boats, but then larger boats to bring passengers and cargo to shore. Um, really beginning with Banning and um, his move in 1858 into the estuary to Wilmington. They're going all the way up the channel through the estuary to reach his wharf, and his boats. They get much beyond the small rowboat, where uh, things had been about a decade before, and then you had to get out and scramble through the water to actually reach the beach at Old San Pedro. Um, so it depends kind of how you define it. They're moving ahead. By the 1890s, and you'll see this in old photographs. I'm sure they have these as well in the city archives. They're using the entrance channel, particularly for lumber ships. And that part of the estuary has harbor lines set already, I believe around 1890. And so that was the result of the project to build a jetty to open the estuary mouth. And that jetty starts to be constructed in the early 1870s, 73, I believe, although it takes a while to complete. They have problems with it, and then eventually they upgrade it to a stone boulder jetty around 1886. I believe. And so at that point, they can get in the mouth of the estuary uh, um, with ships that are getting larger. And I think it's not till you get the Army engineers dredging, going all the way up into the inner harbor. And that's probably sometime after 1915 to 1920. And after the First World War has ended, where you're going to start to see ships with draft of perhaps 30 feet under the water that can access up there. But my book ended before those technicalities. So I that's the best answer I could give, and I would defer. Maybe somebody else in the audience knows.
Well, and I would say it's an ongoing process because, to my memory, the last time the main channel was dredged was in the late 70s, and it was a joint venture 50-50 between the LA City's Harbor Department and the Army Corps of Engineers. And I may be off on this number, but I believe they dredged it another 50 feet because these container ships were starting to draw a deeper draft, and they needed the deeper channel in order to accommodate commerce between the rest of it, or between the Western Pacific and California.
It's a great point. And on that topic of them having to redredge, both as these container ships get bigger and bigger. But I also recall that there's an initial period, teens to maybe the 1930s, where if they get a big flood event with the LA River, that some of the silt is spilling into the inner harbor. And so there's certainly complaints about that. And that probably was a bee in their bonnet until the rivers are channelized.
And that might have been more impactful to the Port of Long Beach because the Los Angeles River actually empties out in the Long Beach area as opposed to the Los Angeles City area.
Just have another question here. It might be a point of clarification. To Charlie's point about the city trying to use port revenues to balance the LA City budget. The city tried to use monies from two other separate agencies, DWP and airports as well. and B, USSD professor Steve Erie has done much research on this issue.
Well, I think I can feel part of that. The port is controlled by the State Tidelands Commission, and so the Mayor Reardon lost that case. The airport is not controlled by, but dependent on the Federal Aviation Administration, and the federal government has loaned the city or provided a large amount of money to develop LA International Airport. Now they're calling it LAWA, LA World Airports. And the city of Los Angeles could take money from the airport department. They cannot take money from the port because of the Tidelands Commission ruling. But in order to take money from the airport department, they would have to pay the federal government back all the money the federal government had given the city to develop the airport plus interest. And that would be an amount so large that it wouldn't make any sense. Water and power is a separate issue. There's already been an agreement, a court agreement or a legal agreement that no money could come from the water and power with the water fund to the city. But the city is still getting money from the power system fund, but that's a state issue, not a federal issue. Again, to James' point, this whole thing is very complicated when you're talking about money and government and proprietary departments.
Definitely. A couple more I wanted to get to here. Laura asking, did you come across why it wasn't beneficial to have canals, now Avalon, in Wilmington?
I didn't come across it. Is it the mean canals with locks or,
I'm not sure. Maybe if Laura wants to.
if she wants to follow up,
There,
please
yeah.
do. I didn't come across any of that. So I exited the project when really the legacy of Ord's survey, to my mind, had been kind of fulfilled, and I didn't go beyond that. And that sounds like an interesting question for someone to research and answer.
Definitely.
I didn't know that Wilmington ever had canals. I know Venice did, but that was a developer project to lure people to buy property in this area. I've never heard of canals of the type she was talking about in Wilmington.
Right. Let me get this in here from Tess. It's been a wonderful evening. My father was in the U.S. Army. I lived at Fort Ord in 1968, then Panama for 2 years. Later lived near Washington, D.C. Ended up here as a student in Los Angeles history and never knew the story of Ord before tonight. Thank you for this.
And he's talking about the Fort Ord up in the Santa Cruz Bay Area.
And I see a couple of questions about, I just wanted to share the link once again for James's book. I'll put it in the chat. You can order there. There's several different options there to order online. You can also find it at local bookstores here in LA. And definitely encourage everyone to pick it up and read it. I think I'll chime in too. I had a question too. I think one of the things that was for me fascinating about the book is the scope and how much you took in, and it was great hearing sort of the trajectory of how you came to the book. And given all that scope and the players involved and the sort of landscape of the country, did you find sort of challenges or obstacles to sort of try and contain it all? And sort of were there things you felt like you had to maybe leave out or sort of to sort of keep the focus?
Yes, great question. So there were, I gave kind of a sample of these, how you unlock certain historical figures, and the connections just keep going, like a, you know, detective with red yarn. And you know, once you start to hit upon from someone like Ord to a Bache or a Davis and others, William Sherman, Ulysses Grant, those lines, they just keep going and going, and it got quite overwhelming. There were, it just started to connect to so many people who were important politically, militarily, important around Los Angeles in this period of reform and the development of the harbor and the prosecution of the Tidelands cases. Um, and a lot of those names had to be stripped. And so my editor, you know, at a point told me there's too many names and too many names at once. But you know, I geeked out on it, and I was just fascinated. I'd look up who somebody was, a name I didn't know, and I'd see that they did something significant. And I think that is one of the brilliant things about learning history, is starting to see those connections. And you can really start to almost like a social network, like the way we have today, you can really start to see lives intersecting and relationships people have, and the way that that can connect history rather than theory or concepts. And that's, like I said, a joy of being a historian. It's not a joy of being a history writer, because it really takes you under at a certain point. And so I did experience that very much so.
James, I haven't read your book yet. I'm looking forward to reading it. But John Karagosian had a follow-up question. Did you cover the fight between whether Santa Monica or San Pedro was going to be the port for the Port of Los Angeles, or did that come later from your?
I know that is in the book. You know, I believe I left. So the historians who preceded me, who wrote about it, people like Bill Deverell, I left much of it alone. If it was written, and same with when I got to the point of the Tidelands cases, you know, Geraldine's book is so great on that, and so and others whose names I'm forgetting, and so I wrote about it where I could write something different, and so the fight between the Southern Pacific Railroad and Los Angeles interests, especially the Chamber of Commerce, about Santa Monica or San Pedro, came into the story largely as a way of it being a way to bring in Davidson again, who was very, I think, infuriated that what he felt like was the scientific community that knew about coastal sciences in California. At this point, he is just about to be pushed out of the Coast Survey and into the University of California as a professor emeritus. He was infuriated that they weren't seeking science, you know, the science or trusting the science. So I brought in his story. It was a way to bring in Stephen Mallory White, and particularly White in by way of his connection to the Dominguez family's court case, which was working its way up to the Supreme Court. The case of De Geyer versus Banning. And so I touched on the harbor fight in the context of those two things.
And that was basically, I think, between the railroad interests. The Huntingtons wanted Santa Monica, and the Banning family wanted San Pedro, but also the city fathers at the time, because there were no, politically speaking, city mothers. The city fathers of Los Angeles wanted San Pedro also because they wanted to control it.
Yes. Well said. I think there's there's an interesting thing to note there that I think came through in my book, which is that you know, you're dealing with Collis Huntington. He's going to win either way because of their investments at Wilmington, but he knew he would win more at Santa Monica, and so So it's going to set up this next process, really, of the Tidelands cases, where that's fine. That's finally the end for the Southern Pacific in terms of its waterfront ownership.
This is fascinating. I'm going to recommend to my colleague that he talk to you. I think your presentation would be good for one of our Marine Northrop lecture series.
I appreciate that very much, and I've not seen Mike Holland for a very long time. It'd be nice to talk to him again.
Be careful, he's getting older.
I'm going to share the link again. It seems like it may not have come through the first part there, but should be there. I see some questions on it. But I will also be, we've recorded tonight's webinar, and I'll be sending that out in the coming days. So I encourage everyone to share it, and that I'll also include links to the book as well for those who might have missed the link here.
Great story, James, and thank you for bringing it to us, Danny.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I was just going to add one more. James, I know you recently completed this book. I want to ask you, as a fellow writer, I want to say, what's the next book? But what's the next thread maybe that you're sort of, maybe the book got you exploring or looking into?
That's a great question. I'm too exhausted to think about it seriously. But I hope that changes. It would take me away from Los Angeles. But I found George Davidson very fascinating. And I he suffers physically so much for his work. And it was work where he had to stay up all night because he's observing stars. He's rheumatic because he's out in the wild. He I think suffers things that we would call depression or post-traumatic stress. Um, and I think writing the book identified so much with this incredibly ambitious young person who he wanted to he lived in a world that was changing, but yet it was modernizing, yet it seemed infinite, it seemed overwhelming. He lived in a country that was still young and considered an experiment as a republic. And he wanted to work for these things and connect this world and have it make sense and have meaning. And I was just so touched and inspired by his example that I think I would want to know him more. But I think the same is true for Edward Ord as well, because I think there were things about his life and that came through in his letters that I could really only scratch the surface. And I thought this is a fascinating person who is living through such a tough time in the country. He has so many divergent connections as the sectional crisis is developing. He's married into a family of Virginia slaveholders. And I really found his ability to navigate that remarkable in the way that he did.
Great. Plenty to explore. I think you're muted there, Charlie. If you're oh, Charlie, are you talking to us or off camera?
Sorry, I forgot I muted myself. I was just going to mention about Ord that he lived in California after the gold rush, and because the cost of living skyrocketed so much because of the gold fields, he had to take jobs to supplement his Army income surveying for the city of Los Angeles and other governmental entities. So in some ways, we're very lucky that he was here during the gold rush so that we could get some of these maps made.
Yes, and his work for Dominguez and the syndicate, what becomes the Wilmington Syndicate, is also part of his effort to drum up his income. And he writes, and he's very concerned about that. And I think that was an interesting thing about the Ord family, to see people living in this moment where there's no safety net. It's what you make of it, and you have to be dogged and scrappy, and he certainly is. And that's part of why we get this U.S. Reservation for navigable waters.
Right, I think that's all. We're lots of great compliments in the chat there, um, and including Laura, who both read it and listened to it. So that's a great endorsement there. So yeah, I want to thank you once again, James, for joining us, and thank you, Charlie, as well, and thank you to everyone out there. We look forward to seeing you at our next events, and please stay in touch.
Thank you, James.
It's been my pleasure.